Welcome to this print debates on BRICS. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has left for South Africa, where the BRICS summit is going to begin on Wednesday morning. I have with me on this panel, on this show, Dr. Raja Mohan, who's a senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute, Aadil Brar, based in Taipei. He's a columnist for ThePrint and visiting scholar at the National Chengchi University in Taiwan, and Jhanvi Tripathi at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi, where she is an associate fellow at the Geoeconomics program. So let me get into this right away. What is BRICS? It was an acronym that was started more than 20 years ago. Somebody thought it up one morning drinking a cup of coffee, I think. But I'll get into that a little bit later. But the point is, why is Prime Minister Modi in South Africa? Why is he meeting the leaders or the heads of state and government of these five nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa? Russia is represented by Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. Vladimir Putin is not in South Africa. Dr. Raja Mohan, since you are the one with both age and experience, let me start with you. What is your take on why Prime Minister Modi is at BRICS? Does India really care?
No, of course. I mean, you are a member of this forum for so long. Whether it is a good idea to have joined the forum, that's a different story. But the fact is you are a member of it, and you are going to attend it one way or another, like either Putin or through Zoom or otherwise. So I think we are there. I think when Goldman Sachs invented it, they were not doing it for fun. It was a marketing strategy that they put at the turn of the century. The five economies that we talk about today, four at least, the BRIC, the S came later. Right. They were the best performing economies. So Goldman Sachs was trying to market investments into this by saying, here is a new set of countries where you want to put your money and make some money. But I think Russians are the ones who turned this actually a marketing technique by Goldman Sachs into a political organization to promote multipolarity. That's how it started. But today, I think it has got a lot of hype, and there is also a lot of problems that are today increasingly associated with it.
Right. Aadil, may I come to you now? You're in Taipei. You're watching China and India. Xi Jinping, our dear leader from Beijing, will be there at the BRICS summit as well. First of all, do you think that there will be a meeting between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping?
Yeah, this meeting should be interesting, and there's a lot of expectation around what will come out of the meeting. But I think we should lower the expectation a bit, because there is some discord between what India wants from BRICS and what China wants from BRICS. China has a certain expectation about using BRICS for a kind of a geopolitical bulwark against the G7. They've said it out loud. They want to make BRICS into a grouping that targets G7 directly, and they're not shying away from saying that anymore. And New Delhi does not seem to be confident about that kind of thinking, and there will be some pushback. On the other hand, there's some discussion about disengagement and de-escalation at the LAC. But I would again sound, a bit cautious about, these expectations that we might not see these kind of results that people are talking about in the media. It will take a long time, and the discussions will go on between the military leadership instead. But what might come out of the current meeting in Johannesburg is that Modi might convey to Xi Jinping that these ideas that China has about controlling BRICS is something New Delhi is not comfortable about. So you should consider giving India more room within the BRICS mechanism, rather than imposing your views on the whole grouping. And if you want other countries to join, which is another rhetoric that China is kind of promoting, that you should let in Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, which might be more open to Chinese ideas, right, you have to bring in India somehow.
Right. Aadil, I'm going to come back to you on the India-China question. Chinese troops and Indian troops have been facing off for the last 3 years on the line of actual control in Ladakh, and this will be the first meeting, if there is one, a bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping. But I will come back to you on that. Jhanvi Tripathi, may I come to you now? You work in the Geoeconomics program at ORF. How do you see the BRICS summit? How do you see the BRICS grouping unfold 23 years after Goldman Sachs invented this group, in a sense?
Thank you for the question. And as you rightly pointed out, I come from a different perspective than the other panelists. The Geoeconomic perspective. For me, the BRICS, if I were looking at it as an observer, so to speak, is more about what can be achieved despite conflicts and despite the kind of frictions that exist within the grouping. Because the BRICS as a setup would not have lasted so long if some of our issues were not checked at the door before we entered the meeting rooms that we sit in to discuss these big things. But and also to remind us that the members of the BRICS, going back to the foundations of the BRICS, are those countries which are seeing growth despite economic slowdown in the global north. Mm-hmm. And they will continue to see growth in the next near 5 to 10 term. So 5 to 10 year term. So it is very important to keep our eye out on what the BRICS is, able to find consensus on, because it is in many ways a voice for the global south, which is a very big agenda for India, and it fuels our continued support for the BRICS setup.
Okay. Dr. Raja Mohan, the G20 is going to take place in Delhi a few days from now, 2 weeks or so from now. In the run-up to the G20, you have the BRICS summit. Now, both Xi Jinping is going to be at BRICS and at the G20. How do you look at these two groupings? On the one hand, you have, the world's largest 20 economies, in which you have China and Russia as well, also part of BRICS. But how do you see them? Do you see them as contradictory in nature, or do they complement each other in some way?
No, both are becoming dysfunctional. I mean, there's no question. I mean, the G20, which came in the wake of 2008 financial crisis, today does not agree on either key political issues, that Ukraine, or on the economic issues, say WTO, where the differences between US and China are deep. So I think multilateralism itself is in a crisis. So I don't see G20, if you can manage to basically stop people from fighting, and you can produce a minimal consensus on some marginal issues, that will be a triumph. But that has nothing to do with the BRICS. So I think BRICS was set up in the 20 years ago as an organization to promote multipolarity. But the problem today is China and Russia seem to think they can mobilize the BRICS, expand it into an anti-Western forum. I mean, I think that's not going to work. I mean, the Chinese can try. But my sense is the rest of the world is simply not going to be dragooned into lining up behind China in order to fight the West. So there'll be a lot of rhetoric, but watch what they do. I doubt if there's anything great or significant is going to come out of either of these meetings.
So just a quick follow-up, Dr. Raja Mohan, you think that at the BRICS summit, both China and Russia are going to try and make this into an anti-West forum? Do you think the other three countries are not going to, they're going to resist that?
No, why would India want to join such a lineup? I mean, I think what we don't see is the context in which BRICS got formed is very different today. In the 2000s or in the 1990s, when the RIC got the initial idea of a strategic triangle between India, Russia, and China, at that time for India, the fear was the American policies on Kashmir and on nuclear proliferation were threatening. Therefore, India was going to join Russia and China in hedging against American unipolar movement. Okay. So the idea was to promote a unipolar movement, was to limit the power of a unipolar hegemony and make it into a multipolar world. But today, I think India's problem is not a unipolar world, but it's a problem is unipolar Asia. Mm-hmm. That China's dominance over Asia is the principal problem for India. For all the talk about BRICS, and everybody has these numbers, 45% of the GDP, but half of it is China. So I think it is China's assertiveness that creates the problems for India. And whatever Indians might say publicly or not, they have no reason today to line up behind China and shoot against the US, because it is the US that helps India on the nuclear issue, on technology issue, on Kashmir, while right. China is the problem. So I don't think there's any rocket science here. China is our principal problem, and we're not going to simply boost China so that they make our problems even worse than they are today.
Let me ask you this, Jhanvi. In your view, do you think multilateralism is in a crisis? Do you think that India should be part of multilateral organizations like BRICS, like the RIC? What do you think?
There's no denying multilateralism is in crisis at this stage. The UN is dysfunctional, the WTO is dysfunctional, the IMF is refusing to reform. But I would be wary and careful of putting the G20, BRICS, and other such groupings in the same basket as multilateralism as a whole.
Why?
I would very much look at them in their true sense as plurilateral groupings and attempts to create consensus in plurilateral formats. And I agree with Professor Raja Mohan on the threat that India may or BRICS members may get swept away because of specific partners having too much of a say. But I would also be cautious of rejecting these groupings as a whole, because it means that we have a seat at the table, we have a voice at the table, and India has a reputation in the last decade at least. We have created a reputation and space in the international community to be able to speak for the Global South, to be able to listen to their voices. The voices of the Global South Conference, before we started our G20 presidency, in a sense, was a declaration of intent from our part. So while we can be skeptical of how much of a practical impact the BRICS or the G20 will have, there is still some sort of an idealistic and a sort of general ideological argument to be made to remain committed to these groupings.
So a quick follow-up, Jhanvi. So do you think that India will be able to overcome the China-Russia duopoly at the BRICS?
I think instead of focusing on the China-Russia duopoly, we really need to start looking at how well India, Brazil, and South Africa work together. India is completing its G20 presidency. Brazil will follow South Africa after that. It's a rare opportunity for IPSA and therefore BRICS to impact G20 level policy making. And if we look at the South African BRICS agenda, if we look at India's G20 agenda, there are points of commonality. So at least there can be consensus made on these larger issues that impact us: sustainable development, climate change, the things where we want the focus to be on and not get distracted by big power politics.
Okay, that's a fair point. Aadil, let me come back to you and ask you the question I asked you before, which is that, do you think multilateralism is in a mess? Do you think that India and that China is the problem in Asia, not just in Asia, but across the world, and that India's priority is how to deal with China and not worry about organizations or multilateral groupings like BRICS?
Multilateralism is under somewhat of a threat. I agree with that point. But I don't think that we should completely sit out of these meetings. These mechanisms are not exactly functioning the way they should. But there are other countries, middle powers like Indonesia and rising powers as well. They see opportunity in the current environment, like settling trade in the local currency, something many countries are excited about nowadays. So if India sits out of these meetings, then we don't have an opportunity to at least somewhat influence the outcome. But we should also be vocal about how China is trying to shape these mechanisms through their ideology, and we have to be much more vocal about, connecting these things back to China. That China is promoting a certain kind of worldview within BRICS, within G20, and other mechanisms. I don't think we are exactly loud enough about that. And we've not made our displeasure about Chinese idea of community of shared future, the kind of language that Xi Jinping likes to repeat constantly when he talks about geopolitics. We've not really countered those arguments enough that we can make India's position hard and clear that sure, China is here to stay somehow. They are going to be around, but we want India to be a country that has significant presence in the future, whether it's through G20 and BRICS. So China is definitely a problem that India has to face, but we have to find creative ways to send that message across rather than just sitting out.
Okay. Dr. Raja Mohan, if Prime Minister Narendra Modi meets Xi Jinping, what do you think he should say to him?
Look, I think there are two separate issues here. I mean, one is BRICS, one is bilateral.
No, I'm asking about the bilateral meeting, considering that Indian and Chinese troops have been facing off for the last 3 years. What do you think Prime Minister Modi should say to the Chinese president?
Before I come to that, I mean, let me just say we are not sitting out of plurilateral or multilateral meetings. The fact that we are sitting in BRICS is to be there and influence the decisions that are taken. So it's not that India has abandoned BRICS. It is, you've got to recognize what is the principal problem. The second is, India also sits in the Quad. India sits in the G7. India sits in a whole range of institutions. So it's not abandoning multilateralism. It is recognizing a new moment here in the international system, where a rising China is challenging a number of international propositions and posing more direct threat to many of its neighbors. So the question is, how do we deal with that? Second, on the bilateral, I don't think I can tell Prime Minister what to tell Mr. President. But I don't think there will be any negotiations. Look, if there is something that they've cooked up, the bureaucrats, the emperor does not negotiate, nor does our leader sit and negotiate, how do we move our troops? If there was an agreement cooked up by diplomats and generals for the last few weeks, if there is something reasonable and substantive, they say, wah, wah, shabash, let's go from here. But I don't know. So unless you know what has actually happened, in the last few weeks in these so-called meetings on confidence-building measures. So I think it'll be, if they meet, like they met in Bali, exchanges, courtesy, pleasantries. But the real story is we don't know what has happened in the last few weeks of contacts. Mr. Doval met Wang Yi, before that Mr. Jaishankar met Wang Yi. So has something come out of it? Since then, there have been these meetings in the border. So that is a real issue. So I don't think the two leaders will have, say, 30 minutes, 15 minutes in translation. They're not going to do any serious talk. I mean, if there is something they've cooked up, they say, look, let's resume proper bilateral engagement. Then we know that there's some progress has been made. But then people would want to know what actually is the progress that has been agreed upon. So all this is still up in the air. So I'm not, breathless waiting for the two leaders to meet.
Okay. Jhanvi, can I ask you about the BRICS, the geoeconomics part of it? Now, are you in favor of a BRICS currency?
I would be very cautious of any common currency given the European experience. I think the direction that even our foreign ministry has taken of trading in our own currency is a practical one, is a useful one. It decreases dependence on the dollar. We are not held hostage to the whims of any other country, whether it be to our right or to our left. So trading in our own currency, great. Common currency, very cautious about it, to be very direct.
What about a bank, a BRICS bank?
We have a wonderful BRICS bank, the New Development Bank. It's one of the most successful institutional initiatives of the BRICS because it gives us an alternative to larger banks created by and for the West, which, again, hold countries hostage to their own requirements and rules in terms of liberalization. The NDB, of course, is not an entity that does not require reform. It requires its own, it has its own set of problems. But using the NDB as both hard and soft tool for geoeconomic collaboration between the BRICS and beyond, because it works with partners outside of the BRICS as well, I think it merits a lot more study.
A lot more studies. So you are cautious about that. You think India should be much more careful before it it works with that.
We're already working with it. It's not a matter of working with the NDB. It's about how much more power we're willing to give to it, how much more we are willing to do with the amount of resources we negotiate with the NDB, because the NDB and the kind of credit it gives for infrastructure development is different in nature from what we get from other banks. And therefore, the NDB is an alternative that the BRICS has been able to create in the international order. What merits study is it a mirror alternate? Is it a new sort of dynamic? What is it that we are trying to achieve in the next 15 to 20 years with the NDB?
Aadil, you're sitting in Taipei. I want to ask you, how does China see, I mean, China is of course, the big next door, mainland China, the sort of the big dragon looming large. But how do Taiwanese as well as Beijing, how do the people look at the face-off on the line of actual control between India and China for the last 3 years?
There's been growing realization that India has started staying in South China Sea and in the Taiwan context as well. You might have read that the three former chiefs, service chiefs, were in Taipei recently from New Delhi. So we've started making certain kind of message has been sent across to Beijing that India is going to be quite active. And in Taiwan, we can see that people are interested in seeing India playing a kind of a new role. Though there's a history going back when New Delhi and Taipei tried to work together, things didn't exactly move forward. But now there's a new kind of synergy in terms of investment, like Fox and others. So people are quite excited about what's going on between India and Taiwan. And meanwhile, Beijing is not exactly happy how New Delhi is engaging Taiwan, and New Delhi is becoming a new, economic kind of bloc in the region that can counter China's, growth trajectory. So that's where we stand now. And in terms of the border standoff, I think there's a kind of an appreciation that the PLA is busy at the border, so we don't have tensions here, which is a kind of crude way of putting it out there. But that's the understanding that now PLA is still kind of caught up in the LAC context, so we might not see any conflict in the Taiwan Strait anytime soon. But these two contexts are very much linked because the PLA is training, exercising scenarios, and training the officers for future contingencies. So we might see India and Taiwan working together to addressing these kind of security situations as they emerge.
But what is Beijing trying to do by this sort of aggressive stance that it has taken over the last 3 years on the India-China LAC?
One view is that
from Beijing?
One view is that Beijing is trying to tell New Delhi not to get too close to the US. It's a view that many experts have aired, and some of the recent commentary also suggests that India should not be getting too close to US. But there's also a perspective that you have to keep India on an edge so that you can limit its options. That's my own understanding. If you have India kind of sitting on the edge, kind of trying to negotiate peace with Beijing, then you can limit its opportunities, limit its options, so that it cannot get back to you with a new kind of geopolitical environment, creating alliances in the region, so that you keep it struggling in a way. So that is my own understanding, that Beijing has an interest in keeping this LAC tension going on for even maybe another 2 years or 3 years. We don't know how long it will last. But even if there is some kind of concession or a bargain today between New Delhi and Beijing, it might just be a partial bargain. We might not see a full-scale disengagement, and this tension will continue to last because we've seen exercises happen at the LAC even till date. There are PLA soldiers carrying different kind of interesting weapons at the LAC even in the past few days. So I don't think the LAC is going to be settled anytime soon.
Dr. Raja Mohan, do you think a possible meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping in South Africa could pave the way for Xi Jinping's presence at the G20 summit in Delhi? Because there will be questions asked, won't there be, that Xi Jinping is here. Chinese troops have been facing off for the last 3 years. They are in possession of territory where Indian troops cannot patrol any longer. So what is your view?
See, look, a possible meeting in which a potential reconciliation could take place to suggest a likely visit by Chinese president to Delhi. Look, I think, we really, whenever it comes to China, we seem to twist ourselves into some kind of a knot. I don't see why.
Not a knot. I think it's a fair question.
Look, he's a member of the G20, second largest economy. He can happily come. Look, India is not making it a condition that you come here and you can't come to a multilateral meeting without solving the easing of the bilateral tensions. We've attended a lot of online meetings with Xi Jinping since 2020. So I don't see why the meeting is so important for G20.
Okay, so you think it's fine for Xi Jinping to come to Delhi, even if there is this tension on the LSE? You think it's fine?
I don't see any problem. I mean, look, we lived with this tension for 3 years. We kept up the negotiations. India is not desperate to say, look, let's solve the problem so that his emperor has to come to Delhi. It's not. India is standing up on the border.
Okay.
So that's where I said the real story isn't, has any negotiations taken place in the last few weeks? Have they produced any mutually satisfactory results? There's no reporting on these. So if he comes, he comes. Look, if he doesn't come, the world doesn't fall. If Putin doesn't come, the BRICS is not falling apart. So I don't think we should make this into some kind of a life or death situation if His Excellency Xi Jinping doesn't show up in Delhi in a physical meeting. So look, the relationship is in a bad shape. It's not been as bad as it is for such a long time. So I think, I'm sure there is some imperatives for both to find a way out. We've been patient for 3 years. If something moves, the meeting will take place and probably it will be a positive meeting. But I
like
think
what? Like what could the possible solution be?
The real question is not whether he comes to Delhi or not. The question
So what could, sorry, say.
Wang Yi has been saying for the last 3 years, look, border issue has happened. Let's keep it aside. Let's go back to normal business. Don't block our investments. We want to do everything. I just slapped you on the border, but don't take it personally. Let's get back to other business as usual. Delhi is saying, sorry, they can't be business as usual till you reverse what happened in April 2020.
Right.
That's what two positions are. Now, is there a way of bridging this? I don't know. Have they been bridged? We know even less. So I think these positions are fundamentally difficult to reconcile unless our Chinese friends agree to restore, at least move towards a restoration of status quo ante. And that, I think, that cannot be done overnight. So my sense is there can be an engagement, there can be announcement of new CBMs, but I don't see breakthroughs taking place at this point of time. So I think we should temper our expectations. I think India has to be very, very patient and firm in dealing with China, which is what the Delhi has shown, that it can be patient, it can be firm. It's not so eager to have an engagement with China. It is willing to take measures on business, on a range of things which have been costly. So I would say we are at a bad place. Whether we can get out of the bad place depends a lot on what Mr. Xi Jinping has to offer and whether he has actually offered that in the negotiations over the last few weeks.
Okay. Jhanvi, do you think that the economic relationship between the 5 BRICS nations, and right now we're now talking about an expanded BRICS, could help pave the way or smoothen the way for a possible reconciliation between India and China? I mean, I'm not only asking you whether there can be across the BRICS spectrum better economic relationship, but really between India and China, which is clearly what is, something that is all absorbing us.
That is a very naughty question to ask, but I will answer it regardless. I don't think it's actually a correlated setup where BRICS functions, therefore we are able to, as India and China, negotiate bilateral issues. Economics is working where it's working. India has matured in terms of its foreign policy. We have been able to delineate our bilateral security concerns from our economic worldview. We have taken very firm economic stands when it comes, despite, as Professor mentioned, despite cost to our economy, but we have been able to overcome those costs. And we have been able to do that because we have a more open economic system now. We have been able to find alternatives. I don't think we should try and equate a functioning BRICS economic setup with sort of India and China having better bilateral relations. Our security relations and our economic relations are running on different paths right now. If we look at the trade data, it is telling us the story. If we look at our
What is the story your trade data is telling you?
That we continue to trade at high volumes with China. In terms of imports as well as exports. We have been able to diversify despite that. Our supply chains, we are doing our best to reduce dependence on China, but that is a story for every country in the world. It is not just India which is trying to reduce dependence. It is an economic imperative that we reduce dependence on one country. It is a more urgent imperative for India, given our security concerns, because we cannot be dependent on a fickle partner for essential commodities. But I don't think it's a India-only problem. It's a problem for the rest of the world as well. So I would be very careful of making it conditional that the BRICS economic system functions, therefore India and China are able to resolve bilateral issues. We both have mature foreign policies. India has become more assertive in its foreign policy. It is taking a stand for what is good for its own economy, its own citizens. Citizens first has been the line that we have drawn, and I think it's okay to stick to it as a sovereign nation.
Okay. Aadil, you have the last question. You've heard both Jhanvi and Dr. Raja Mohan on the China issue. Now, tell me, do you think that as bilateral trade, as Jhanvi said, increases every year, and even during the pandemic, it just went up and up. Do you think that you should keep the business side or the economic side away and separate it and have like a great wall between the strategic issues and the economics?
I think that will be a big blunder in the present context. We could have done that maybe 20 years ago or 10 years ago, because the geopolitical environment that we face today and the kind of aspiration that China has, these two things are not exactly disconnected. They're very much connected. If we let business kind of boom on its own and continue to grow in a certain pace, we might find ourselves living in a very different world, especially in Asia. So we have to be mindful about letting certain kind of Chinese businesses come into India and gain more access, because that will create a scenario where we are not able to in the future counter these businesses. And at that point, it will be difficult for, to kick them out in a sense. So we'll have to be more cautious, more aware about what does China want, what ideas does it have about its geopolitical aspirations. So we can't just keep them separated anymore.
Right. Thank you all. What does China want is the big question, and perhaps we should answer. We should ask ourselves, what does India want, or what does Brazil, South Africa, and Russia want? But we will leave that for another day and another time. Thank you so much, Aadil Brar, Dr. Raja Mohan, and Jhanvi Tripathi. Thank you for joining me on the Print Debates.
Thank you, Jyoti. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti. Thank you.